Namaskar, this is Firstpost and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma. The big story tonight comes from China. They have sacked their foreign minister, the one who went missing. We've been telling you about his disappearance. His name is Qin Gang. He's been missing for weeks now. First, China pretended it wasn't even happening. Then they said he was unwell, and then reports of an affair emerged. Now the man has been sacked. On Vantage tonight, we'll bring you the inside story. Also, while China claims Prime Minister Modi and President Xi held a meeting last year and arrived at an important consensus. New Delhi has not commented on this. It says tensions at the border have eroded trust. Then what explains Beijing's claims? We'll discuss that. Minorities in Europe continue to be targeted. Yet another Quran has been set on fire. Muslim nations are protesting. In the US, non-resident Indians are hoarding rice. The scenes at supermarkets are quite dramatic. We look at the making of what could be a global food crisis. In Pakistan, the army chief says they should throw away their begging bowl. The question is how? And chocolate has been hit by the war and the weather. We'll bring you more. The headlines first. The war intensifies. Russia claims it repelled a drone attack on a Black Sea patrol ship and destroyed 2 unmanned Ukrainian boats. Meanwhile, Kiev says it is making advances against Russian forces in the south. Taiwan braces for Typhoon Doksuri. It is forced to cut short its largest annual military drills. This is the strongest typhoon to hit the island in 4 years. It is expected to make landfall in China on Friday. North Korea fires 2 ballistic missiles as it prepares for the Korean War anniversary celebrations. Russia and China will send delegations to attend. The Russian side will be led by Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. This is the first such visit to North Korea since the pandemic. The United States formally rejoins the UNESCO. US First Lady Jill Biden marks Washington's re-entry with a flag-raising ceremony in Paris. The Americans left in 2017 citing an anti-Israel bias. They've returned at a time when China leads the UN body. Heat waves in the US and Europe would be impossible without climate change. A new study says climate change has made their summers 2.5 degrees hotter and that all countries should be prepared for extreme heat. After 100 years, you can finally swim in the Seine again. Paris is in the final phase of a historic cleanup that cost around $1.6 billion. France is determined to make its iconic river the star of the 2024 Summer Olympics. And Saudi Arabia's Al Hilal makes a record offer for French footballer Kylian Mbappe. Reports say the club made a bid of $332 million to acquire the striker. Mbappe currently plays for French football club PSG. If this deal goes through, it will be the most expensive transfer in football history. We begin with China. It suffered a political earthquake today. China has sacked its foreign minister, a man called Qin Gang. He will go down in history books as China's shortest ever serving foreign minister, also the one who disappeared. That happened a month back. China has been hemming and hawing about it since. First, they said nothing. They absolutely said nothing about it, refused to talk about what happened. Then they said Qin Gang is sick, but the story did not add up. All sorts of rumors began doing the rounds. Then there was talk of an affair. Beijing never confirmed anything, but today they pulled the plug. The minister was fired, no reasons given, quite dramatic even by China's standards. This is how it played out. There was a snap meeting of the top brass today. It ended with a statement. It said Qin Gang is leaving his post and Wang, his predecessor, is now back as foreign minister. I have that statement with me. Just look at what it says. Barely 2 lines of text. We have a machine-generated translation and I'm quoting, Qin Gang was removed from the position of Minister of Foreign Affairs. Wang has been appointed foreign minister. That's it. As cold and terse as it gets. And it raises more questions than it answers. Why has China made this change? Why is Qin Gang leaving? And why is Wang being brought back? If China wanted to avoid questions and Scott's speculation over Qin Gang, they've only made it worse for themselves. For weeks now, they've been facing relentless scrutiny, endless questions about their foreign minister. One of the top leaders of the country, he just dropped off the radar and disappeared, just like that. He was last seen in public on the 25th of June. He met with officials from 3 countries, Sri Lanka, Vietnam and Russia. And this meeting happened in Beijing. This was his last public engagement as Foreign Minister of China. The next day, he disappeared. He was supposed to travel to Bali to attend an ASEAN meeting, but he did not go. China said he was not feeling well. And instead of him, they sent Wang to Indonesia. And then it became a pattern. Wang started filling in for Qin Gang on all occasions, and Beijing refused to explain why this was happening. There was complete and total silence on the disappearance. High-profile meetings were called off. Europe's top diplomat was supposed to visit Beijing this month. His trip was abruptly postponed. Just 2 days before, Josep Borrell was supposed to fly to Beijing. He was told to not come. China said the visit was no longer possible, and they did not explain why. This information vacuum was filled with rumors. All kinds of stories were doing the rounds. There were claims of a purge. Some said the minister was being punished. What for? Again, no answers. Then another story started getting traction. It said the minister had an affair. He was linked to a journalist, Fu Xiaotian. She's a prominent face on Chinese television. And how is she related to Qin Gang? Well, this is what rumors/reports say. When Qin Gang was an ambassador in the United States, he met Fu and he gave her an interview. And it gets murky from here on. Apparently, Fu has given birth to a baby in the US, and soon after this, she too disappeared from the public eye. Has the minister been punished for this? China's foreign ministry was asked about all of it, about the alleged affair. The spokesperson was awkward and evasive in her response. Take a look at this.
Does the Foreign Ministry have any update on Foreign Minister Qin Gang and when he will return to public duties? Or why he's been out of the limelight for 3.5 weeks now? Financial Times again. The Times of London has reported that Qin Gang's disappearance is related to being under investigation for an affair with Fu Xiaotian, a Phoenix TV reporter who recently gave birth in the US. Do you have any comment on that?
The Chinese diplomat said, "I have no information to offer." To make matters worse, they deleted that statement from the final transcript of the press conference. So was it because of the affair? Well, there could be another explanation, and this is related to Xi Jinping himself. Qin was part of his inner circle, a trusted lieutenant who was rewarded for his loyalty. His rise to the top brass was meteoric. He used to be a protocol officer, someone who looked after Xi Jinping's foreign trips. Qin Gang worked closely with Xi Jinping. He is said to have impressed the Chinese president in that role. So he was given a promotion. He became China's top diplomat in the US in 2021, China's ambassador to the US. Less than 2 years into that role, he was called back to Beijing and he was named the country's foreign minister, one of the youngest appointees to this post. Now, when you rise that fast in China, you're bound to make others jealous. You make political enemies. From the outside, the Communist Party may appear like a tight-knit unit, but inside it is fractured. There are political camps. They wrestle with each other for power, and it is quite possible that Qin Gang fell victim to party infighting. He was appointed in December last year. 7 months later, he's been fired. Reports say he'll still remain a state councillor. This is a high-ranking position within the executive, but he'll certainly be less influential. We expect more details to come out in the days and weeks ahead. But whatever the reason for his sacking and disappearance, he has clearly fallen out of favor with Xi Jinping. And now let's tell you about China's new old foreign minister. I say this because he held the post before Qin Gang and he's been reappointed today. When the announcement was made, Wang was in South Africa for a BRICS meeting. And on the sidelines, he met Ajit Doval, the National Security Advisor of India. What followed was a predictable pattern. India stated its position. Doval said China's aggression at the border has eroded trust, and the relationship cannot go back to normal until the border tensions are eased. And what did China say? Well, the same old spiel. The border is not a key issue, it is just one aspect of the relationship. It should not compromise India-China ties. The Chinese have always said this. Ignore the troops at the border, let's talk business instead. So we're basically going around in circles. But that's not what our story is about. Tonight we want to focus on a Chinese statement. Beijing has made a big claim. It is about Prime Minister Modi and President Xi. China says they spoke last year and they reached some kind of consensus. That's the word they used, consensus. In fact, let me quote from the statement. At the end of last year, President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi reached an important consensus on stabilizing China-India relations in Bali. What are the Chinese talking about? They are referring to last year's G20 summit. It was hosted by Indonesia. There was a dinner for G20 leaders. Both Prime Minister Modi and President Xi were present. They met briefly. It wasn't a sit down. This was the moment, what you see on your screen. The video doesn't tell us very much. We can see the leaders talking, but it's not clear what they said to each other. It appears to be a brief and informal interaction. But Beijing is now offering a very different version. China says there was consensus to restore ties. And what does New Delhi say about this? Well, they're sticking to their old version. According to the Ministry of External Affairs, the leaders just exchanged pleasantries, nothing more than that. Listen to the statement they made after the encounter in Bali.
With regard to the question relating to the handshake between the Prime Minister and President Xi Jinping, I will only say that Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping, who were both attending the G20 dinner yesterday, hosted by the Indonesian President, exchanged courtesies at the conclusion of the dinner.
So according to India, Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping have not spoken to each other since 2020. It shows how the relationship has suffered. It's a major shift from the days of informal summits when China hosted Prime Minister Modi in Wuhan and India reciprocated by hosting Xi Jinping in Varanasi and Mamallapuram. But in the last 3 years, there has been a total freeze in high-level contact. So why is China claiming consensus? How can you achieve a quote-unquote important consensus on such a complex issue in such a brief interaction? China's claims seem to be like a distraction, a way to divert attention from the real issue, which is the Chinese soldiers on the Indian border. There are 50,000 of them, according to one estimate. 50,000 Chinese soldiers. Is China planning to reduce those numbers? By the looks of it, no, they're not. Let's go back to their statement. What does it say about troop withdrawal? Well, nothing. I'll quote again. It says India and China should focus on consensus and cooperation, overcome interference and difficulties, and promote the return of bilateral relations to the track of healthy and stable development at an early date. Contrast this with India's statement. It only talks about the situation at the border. I'm quoting again. During the meeting, NSA conveyed that the situation along the LAC in the western sector of the India-China boundary since 2020 had eroded strategic trust and the public and political basis of the relationship. The statement calls the standoff, quote unquote, an impediment to normalcy. Strong words, but they haven't moved the needle with Beijing. For 3 years now, India and China have been locked in this face-off. Yes, there has been some disengagement, but a complete de-escalation still remains a long shot. There have been many rounds of military dialogue. The two armies met for the first time in June 2020. Since then, they've met some 18 times, 18 meetings, but the border remains an unresolved issue. At least 2 friction points still remain, Depsang and Demchok. Reports say in these areas, the Chinese side has tried to block Indian patrols, but the Indian troops have not pulled back. Just like the Chinese, they remain firmly entrenched. Meanwhile, Beijing continues to ramp up infrastructure. There are reports of a Chinese bridge in Pangong So. This is the same region where Indian and Chinese troops clashed in the year 2020. China is building a bridge there now. There's a lot of activity. China has added many roads, bridges, and new military bases along the border. In case of a conflict, such infrastructure is critical. It can speed up supplies of weapons and troops to the border. It can be the difference between victory and loss in a war. And China has a lead in this game by many decades. India is trying to catch up. It is building a new road in the north bank of Pangong Tso. It should be completed by 2025. India is also making an infrastructure push on many other fronts. New roads, new bridges and tunnels are being added to make remote areas more accessible. In the last 2 years, more than 200 such projects have been completed. Another 176 projects are in the pipeline on the Indian side. Today's engagement reaffirms the need for all of this. The Chinese are not going anywhere. They will distract and deceive. India must be prepared for their next move. On to Europe now. Another copy of the Quran has been burnt there. First it was Sweden, now it's Denmark. The incident happened on Monday. 2 members of a far-right group gathered outside the Iraqi embassy in Copenhagen. They stomped the holy book. They placed it inside a tin foil tray and then they set fire to it. This is the second incident in less than 4 days. The same group burnt the Quran on Friday as well. They live streamed the whole thing on Facebook. Back then, Muslim nations were outraged, especially Iraq, because their embassy was involved. Thousands of Iraqis hit the streets of Baghdad. They protested outside the Danish embassy. But it made no difference. Within 2 days, there has been a repeat. Another Quran has been burnt, which makes you wonder, is this the new normal in Europe? We saw 2 Quran burning incidents in Sweden and now another 2 in Denmark. Why have authorities not cracked down yet? Why are such protests still being permitted? Sweden says they're defending freedom of expression. But what exactly are these people expressing? From the looks of it, Islamophobia. Both governments are guilty of tacit support. You know something is wrong. You know you can stop it, but you're choosing not to. Just look at Sweden. They permitted Quran burnings on 2 occasions. Both times the same man was involved. And what action has the Swedish police taken against him? They filed preliminary hate crime charges against him. Do you see how absurd that is? First, you give permission to burn the Quran, and afterwards, you file hate crime charges. It makes no sense whatsoever. Why not deny permission in the first place? In both countries, the governments have criticized the Quran burning. They say it doesn't reflect their position. Why then does it keep happening? It's easy to dismiss these stunts, to say that the fringe is doing what the fringe does. But when the government does not do anything to stop them, it is not the fringe, is it? You're mainstreaming them. Sweden and Denmark may not realize this now, but such policies will affect their ties with the Islamic world. In fact, it's already happening. Iraq has expelled the Swedish ambassador. They're calling the Danish incident a case of extremism. Turkey has called it despicable and vile. Algeria has summoned envoys from Denmark and Sweden. Iran and Saudi Arabia have condemned the incident. Qatar is going a step ahead. The country's biggest market will no longer sell Swedish products. So the outrage is growing. But what explains this dangerous trend of burning the Quran? Why in Sweden and Denmark? Do they have a large Muslim population? Well, not particularly. Around 5% of Denmark's population is Muslim, around 8% in Sweden. And this is the European average, close to the European average. Germany is at 6%. France is much higher at 10%. So numbers don't seem to be the problem. Then what is it? Well, sentiments. Migration and demography have been weaponized by Europe's far right. In simple words, they fearmonger. They say Europe will become a Muslim continent, or migrants will plot terrorist attacks. And this fear has given them political power. Last year, Sweden voted for a right-wing government, their first ever. Denmark still has a left-leaning government, but their majority is razor thin. It's the same story across Europe. Right-wing parties have used migration and demographics to win seats. Their leaders drop occasional dog whistles. But the far right goes beyond that. They don't use dog whistles, they use a big Islamophobic trumpet. And that's one part of the problem. The second part is the legal framework. Western commentators say they do not have blasphemy laws. No laws, so no punishment. But that argument doesn't really work here. 79 countries in the world have specific blasphemy laws. Are the rest burning Qurans every day? I don't think so. These incidents are not about blasphemy. It's about hate crimes. It's about Islamophobia. But will Sweden and Denmark accept that? Their laws are built for homogeneous societies, basically white Christians. They don't account for religious or racial diversity, and that is a problem because what is offensive to one religion could be sacred to another. Europe must realize this. They keep lecturing the world about minorities, how they should be protected, how their rights and culture must be promoted. But at home, it's the exact opposite. People are burning the holy book of your minority group, and what is your response? You say it's freedom of expression. Take a look at this website. It's run by the Council of Europe. It shows a framework on protecting national minorities. This law was introduced in 1998. So this year, 2023, is the 25th anniversary. Maybe it's time for a re-evaluation because Europe's minorities are scared. They feel insulted and abused. Europe's one-size-fits-all approach is clearly not working. It's alienating their own Muslim citizens. It's also turning Muslim countries against them. Meanwhile, there is talk of a global food crisis. Prices are increasing, supply is shaky. What should you be doing in such a situation? We'll try to answer that question, but first, look at what you should not be doing. Those are NRIs living in the US, non-resident Indians. Many of them have been flooding supermarkets. What for? To stock up on white rice, or rather to hoard. You can see them climbing on shelves to find more bags. Some families bought 10 to 15 of them. This frenzy does not help anyone. If you hoard supplies, you're creating a shortage, meaning prices will rise even more. So buy only what is necessary. Make sure you leave enough for others. Having said that, how did this frenzy begin? It began with an export ban by India. Last week, India stopped the export of non-basmati white rice. The monsoons were late, prices were rising, so India wanted to keep enough stock for domestic consumption. The downside, the global market was not ready for this kind of shock. You see, India makes up 40% of all rice exports, 40%. Around half of that is non-basmati rice. If that disappears from the market overnight, what will happen? Prices will rise. And that's exactly what is happening. Thailand and Vietnam were the first to hike the price. They increased it by $5 to $10 per ton. But the fear is more hikes will follow. Traders are expecting prices to rise by $50 per ton, 50. And even then, supply is not a guarantee. India ships around 20 million tons of rice. It is the largest exporter in the world. The next four are Thailand, Vietnam, Pakistan and the US. Just one problem though, even if you combine all of them, these four countries, it's not 22 million. So how will they plug the gap left by India? And even if they could, the prices will be ridiculous. Experts say this year's rice production will be the lowest in 20 years. Multiple reasons for that. Bad weather, the war in Ukraine, even supply chain and fertilizer issues. The low output is expected to create a huge shortage. How much? Around 8.7 million tons. This is bad news for the entire world, but especially for Asia. Around 90% of rice produced in the world is consumed in this continent. 90%, it's a staple in this part of the world. But rice is not the only problem. Wheat prices are also rising. They rose by 6% in the last couple of weeks. And you can't blame the weather for this. This is purely man-made. Ukraine is the 5th largest wheat exporter in the world. They make up around 9% of the market. Until this month, Ukraine was allowed to ship that wheat. Russia did not attack their ships. It was called the Black Sea Grain Deal. But Russia has now pulled out of this agreement. What's worse, they're attacking Ukraine's warehouses. Take a look at these pictures. Russian drones struck the last remaining depots on Monday. So Ukraine cannot export wheat anymore. The result is this, a massive rise in prices. This is expected to affect developing countries more. Around 57% of Ukraine's exports went to these countries, developing countries. Only 43% went to developed ones. What does that mean for you? Ukrainian grains are used to produce flour and oil. So both these things will get more expensive. The United Nations realizes this. They played a key role in negotiating the Black Sea Grain Deal. The UN chief is asking Russia now to reconsider its decision. Listen to this.
With the termination of the Black Sea Initiative, the most vulnerable will pay the highest price, as when food prices rise, everybody pays for it. I call on the Russian Federation to return to the implementation of the Black Sea Initiative in line with my latest proposal.
And what exactly is this proposal? The UN says Russia can limit the number of ships involved in the trade, 8 per day. 4 ships will be allowed to dock, 4 ships will be allowed to leave. And what does Russia get in return? Their agriculture bank will be reconnected to SWIFT, which is a global payment system. So far, Putin is unmoved. He says returning to the deal is impossible. So it's a double whammy for the world, rice and wheat. Supplies are shaky. Together with corn, these two items make up 51% of the global diet. What can we do to safeguard it? India is trying to increase the area under rice cultivation, but the plan may or may not succeed because farmers have lost confidence in the monsoon. The rainfall is too erratic. So the area under cultivation may actually drop by the end of this year. As for wheat, the solution is quicker. Supplies are available but stuck in Ukraine. It's a totally avoidable situation, one that is pushing the world towards a food crisis. There is more trouble brewing in Manipur, this time from across the border. More than 700 Myanmar nationals entered the state in 2 days, July 22nd and July 23rd. But these people had no travel documents. Basically, they entered illegally. The Manipur government wants an explanation. It has written to the Assam Rifles. These are a central paramilitary force. They guard India's northeastern borders. The government of Manipur wants to know how these people entered India. It also wants the Assam Rifles to push these people back to Myanmar. Listen to their statement. The state government views the illegal entry very seriously, as the same may have international ramifications in view of the ongoing law and order issues. Some context here. Manipur and Myanmar share a border. It's around 400 kilometers long. It's also very porous. Only 10% of the border is fenced. The rest runs through dense forests and hills. It's very hard to police this region, especially after the Myanmar coup in 2021. The military junta does not have much control over the borders. So people keep going in and out. Why should this worry the government of Manipur? For starters, Myanmar has plenty of tribal militias. They carry weapons and ammunition. If those get into the wrong hands, the violence could escalate. Secondly, there are ethnic links between tribals in Myanmar and Manipur, specifically between the Kukis. You can find members of this community in India, Myanmar and Bangladesh, the Kukis. Last week, a video of Kuki women being paraded naked went viral on social media. One of them had been gang raped. So the entire community feels hurt and insulted, and rightly so. But are Myanmar militias taking matters into their own hands? Are they plotting revenge? Well, right now, it's impossible to say. We have very little information about these 700 Myanmar nationals. For all we know, they're refugees fleeing the military. It's important to keep an eye on them, but it's even more important to not lose perspective. The problem remains inside Manipur. Myanmar militias did not trigger this violence, nor is it their job to control it. That responsibility lies with the state government. On Monday, they arrested a 7th accused in the gang rape case. Just 793 more people to nab. If you're wondering what that means, let me explain. The police report mentions 800 people being part of the mob. Only 7 have been arrested so far. So much for expedited justice. The Manipur government says it is worried about weapons flowing from Myanmar. Like we said, it is a possibility. But the government should have a bigger worry at this point. In the month of May, after the violence started, a police armory was looted. Around 4,000 weapons were taken by the mob. This includes AK rifles, insas and submachine guns. Around 1,000 of them have been recovered, and the rest, well, gone with the wind. These deadly weapons are floating around in Manipur. You can imagine how dangerous that is. A highly charged atmosphere, 2 communities locked in a bloody conflict, and 3,000 weapons still untraceable. Maybe the government should be more focused on those weapons. The next couple of weeks will be crucial for Manipur. And I'll tell you why. The state government has decided to remove the internet ban, not completely but partially. Broadband connections will go online first. Mobile internet will still be jammed. Now, the internet can be a double-edged sword. It could help contain the violence, but it could also make things worse. Only time will tell if this is the right call at this point, but time also has a problematic side effect. It makes you forget It makes you forget who created this problem. You don't get credit for solving your own mess. The state government's policies added fuel to the fire. They cannot escape accountability by blaming Myanmar or restoring the internet. As we keep saying, this is an internal issue. So the blame too must be internal. And now let's turn to the other border of India, Pakistan. Their army chief has rebuked the government. His name is General Syed Asim Munir. He said, and I quote, "All Pakistanis must throw out the begging bowl." It's a noble thought. But as they say, charity begins at home, and the Pakistani establishment is surviving on loans. Look at the most recent developments. Last week, China rolled over another loan to Pakistan. It was for $600 million. Last month, the IMF gave them a $3 billion loan. That's the International Monetary Fund. Then you have Saudi Arabia. They sent Pakistan some $2 billion. The UAE gave them another $1 billion. So throwing out the begging bowl will be tough for the Pakistanis. It is their source of sustenance. And the trend is not new. China is Pakistan's largest bilateral lender. It accounts for 25 to 30% of the country's total external debt. And this is money that Pakistan cannot pay back now. Their coffers are empty. So they keep asking for more loans to repay interest on the old ones. In the last 3 months, China has rolled over about $5 billion in loans to Pakistan. The repayment has been postponed. And this comes as a major relief for Pakistan. As their army chief waxes eloquent, Islamabad is discussing more loans with Beijing. The country is surviving on handouts. It's caught in a vicious cycle. Loans, interests, more loans. Last year, Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif spoke about this, about how even friends now look at Pakistan like a beggar nation. And he's used the begging analogy quite a few times since. Perhaps this candid reflection is not sitting well with the army chief. Yesterday, he spoke at an event. And let me quote from what he said. "Pakistanis are a proud, zealous and talented nation. All Pakistanis must throw out the beggar's bowl." But how will they do it? If the army chief has a strategy, he hasn't shared it yet. He was inaugurating an agricultural farm. We're not sure why, but we can tell you that the Pakistani army runs many businesses. Their chief export, of course, is terrorism. They run many terror factories. But apart from that, they run everything from bakeries to stud farms. Given this context, it's not too odd that the army chief was inaugurating an agricultural farm. Guess what he said about it? "An agricultural revolution is coming to Pakistan." Let me give you his exact words. "The agricultural revolution will continue in Pakistan and no power in the world can stop us from progressing." How very inspiring. But then again, what makes him say this? Not the numbers for sure. The share of agriculture in Pakistan's economy has only been dwindling from about 43% in 1960 to some 22% last year. Agriculture employs about 40% of all Pakistanis, but more than half of them are landless. And climate change is not helping them. Last year, they saw massive floods and losses. So even if there is this agricultural revolution he's talking about, it won't spell the end of Pakistan's economic troubles. And General Asim Munir did not bother to dwell on his point. He moved on to patriotic rhetoric. He said national security and economic stability were interlinked and that the country was like a mother to its people. The relationship between the people and the state is quote unquote one of love and respect. Sounds more like a patronizing lecture than a plan of action, which may have been Munir's goal all along. You see, the farm he inaugurated is also run by the military. Perhaps he was trying to tell people that the army was working for their development and that unlike the civilian government, which was always begging, the army would keep them safe and make them proud. It's an age-old trick, looking good by making the other side look bad. The Pakistani army has a history of doing this. They also have a history of losing wars, of launching coups, causing elected governments to collapse, training terrorists and eating up a lion's share of Pakistan's budget. It's a beast that Pakistan cannot afford to feed, but has no choice. Asim Munir's armed forces are as much to blame for Pakistan's begging bowl situation as its government. They say change is the only constant, but is all change good change? Well, ask Elon Musk and he might say yes. Twitter bid adieu to its iconic blue bird on Monday. Musk has now rebranded the social media platform as X. Tweets are now known as X's. Twitter.com is now X.com. Complete rebranding. But for a brand as iconic as Twitter, it could be dangerous. So why is Elon Musk taking such a huge gamble? Is it because he bought the company for $44 billion? Or is it because he wants to change brand Twitter? Our next report tells you why Elon Musk wants to kill Twitter.
We all know this iconic blue bird, but it wasn't Twitter's first choice for a logo. In fact, it was almost an afterthought. In its early days, Twitter bought a small graphic symbol of a light blue bird for $15. The bird would later go to become its logo, and an iconic symbol in the world of social media. For a decade, the bird has been inseparable from Twitter. But now, Elon Musk is saying goodbye to all the birds, replacing the blue bird with an ominous X. A white symbol on a black background. It almost looks like an Art Deco symbol, nothing like the recognized birdie.
And there's no quicker way to let everybody know that you're doing something new than to have a new logo. So I think it makes total sense as the company shifts that they would want a new direction and a new mark to represent that.
But the project hit a hiccup right on day one. Workers were removing the logo and name at the Twitter headquarters. That's when the police showed up. They stopped the rebrand. Why? Because Twitter did not have proper permits. By the end of the afternoon, all that was left of the Twitter sign was the ER. But that's not the only hiccup. This decision is also complicated legally. X is already used worldwide. It is cited in trademarks. Companies like Meta and Microsoft already have intellectual property rights to the same letter. But even if the name changes, what happens to the brand? Twitter is a social media giant. You want news, you go to Twitter. But Elon Musk has a different plan. He wants to turn it into an everything app, almost like the Chinese WeChat. It'll be a social media platform, there will be messaging, but there will also be payments and streaming, almost like a marketplace of services. Sounds ambitious, but will the users like it?
Well, I mean, I think he's building off of what WeChat did in China, and I don't think it's going to work at all because WeChat also got its launch off of the fact that it was a completely free platform.
So how much will this rebranding cost Elon Musk? He bought Twitter for $44 billion last year. Currently, Twitter is worth $15 billion. That's almost 1/3 of the value he got it for. The rebrand could further wipe off its value. But the transformation is less about Twitter and more about Elon Musk. His connection to the letter X goes back 24 years. That's when he founded X.com. He later named his space exploration company SpaceX. His new artificial intelligence company is called XAI. So this X is no big surprise. But as a company, Twitter has been iconic. Very few brands become a verb, and Twitter is one of them. So when you lose an iconic logo like that, it's almost like a final strike, a nail in the coffin of brand Twitter. Many believe that is exactly what Elon Musk wants. People talking about his X vision and not how much money he's losing on Twitter.
I actually think that this is less about reinventing Twitter and more about building a brand around Elon Musk's current empire, which is, for example, SpaceX, where the X brand really does connect a little bit more closely. So I think this is more about ditching what Twitter has become and trying to build something bigger around connectivity on the SpaceX platform.
So the transformation is a way for Elon Musk to make his mark. It has nothing to do with the users, the advertisers, or Twitter's problems. It goes to show that Twitter is Musk's personal property. He conquered the castle, now he must fly his own flag.
Our next story is about the tech startups of Israel. They have something called Silicon Wadi, their version of Silicon Valley. This is Israel's high-tech coastal region. and it may be winding up. Reports say 70% of Israeli startups have begun moving their operations abroad. 70%. What has triggered this exodus? Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his judicial overhaul, a very controversial move that has led to months of protests in Israel. Yesterday, part of this plan was pushed through the parliament. It set off another wave of demonstrations, blocked roads, and clashes between police and protesters. Among these protesters are founders of tech startups. They fear the government's policies will drive away foreign investors. And before that happens, these companies want to leave. Our next report tells you more.
Almost every section of Israeli society has joined the demonstrations against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. From students to military reservists to tech startup founders, they have all come together to oppose Netanyahu's judicial overhaul plan. Yesterday, a part of the plan passed in Israel's parliament, the Knesset.
So lawmakers, following are the vote results. 64 in favour, no objections, no abstainers. I hereby determine that Fundamental Law Suggestion, Amendment number 4, had passed in third reading and is written into the Book of Laws. This meeting is adjourned. The meeting will resume at 4 o'clock.
This set off a new wave of protests. But another, more long-term form of pushback is also taking place. The exit of tech startups from Israel. Israel has been called a startup nation in recent years. It has a vibrant tech sector. Cities like Jerusalem, Tel Aviv and Haifa, among others, are home to high-tech industries. It's called Silicon Wadi, a pun on Silicon Valley. Wadi is Arabic for valley. Israel's tech sector is a key growth driver for the country's economy. It generates around 16% of the country's GDP, over 50% of its exports, and provides over 25% of the Israeli government's tax revenue. Over the last 40 years, Israel has become a hub for technological innovation. But now, Netanyahu's overhaul threatens to undo all that progress. A survey was conducted of 734 founders and CEOs of startups and managing directors of venture capital funds. They were asked about the judicial overhaul, why they are against it. This is what many of the country's tech entrepreneurs believe.
We came to the stock exchange because this is the symbol of what this craziness of dictatorship is doing to the Israel economy. It's driving Israel economy down from a startup nation, from being a growth nation, from being only second to the Silicon Valley. We become a third world country. There is no chance for our economy, for our high-tech enterprise, for our growth without democracy, without the same kind of values that the U.S. share, liberalism, equality for all, and freedom for all citizens. And that's exactly what this foreign government is trying to take from us.
All around the region, you find authoritarian governments, from the Gulf monarchies to the south to the Iranian theocracy to the east. It's hard to challenge the boundaries of science and tech if an authoritarian regime can shut you down whenever it chooses. That's why it's important to have access to an empowered judicial system. This is what tech startup founders in Israel believe. It's why they have taken to the streets. And it isn't just the startup founders that feel this way. It's also investors. Democratic checks and balances give investors confidence. It positively affects investor sentiment. So Netanyahu's overhaul plan has led to a flight of capital as well. Recent reports say fundraising by Israeli tech firms fell by 73% to just $3.2 billion in the first half of this year. This is compared to $12 billion raised in the first 6 months of 2022. Now, there has been a global fall in investment, but the global average is 50%, not 73% like in the case of Israel. What's more, investor confidence in Israel's recovery is low. Around 65% of investors believe the US will recover within 6 months. Only 12% of investors believe that about Israel. So confidence in Israel's tech sector is low. And a part of Netanyahu's overhaul has passed. Israel's tech startup founders seem to have had enough. And they've begun jumping ship. 22% of Israeli tech companies say they have moved cash reserves outside of Israel to diversify risk. 8% of startups say they have already started the process of moving their headquarters outside Israel. 29% plan to do so in the near future. This is all part of the survey we mentioned earlier. Additionally, layoffs have already taken place in Israel's tech sector, and the entire startup ecosystem is in chaos. Netanyahu may have won the first round in his fight to overhaul Israel's judicial system, but he risks losing the battle for Israel's future if he continues down this path.
For our next story tonight, let's talk about chocolates. We're drawn to them. It feels like an inexplicable instinct. We peel off their crisp wrapping paper and let the smooth, rich taste explode in our mouths. We barely think twice before indulging in a bar of chocolate. But now maybe we'll have to, because our beloved chocolates are facing dark times. We have bitter news for your sweet tooth. Chocolates are becoming more expensive thanks to trouble from their main ingredient, cocoa beans. Prices have been on the rise. They've increased by more than 25% within a year. You ask why? Well, we have two words in answer: global warming. If you say not again, I'm right there with you. Global warming can be blamed for a lot of things: heat strokes, dying fish, even a rise in dengue cases. And now you can add one more thing to that list: a cocoa crisis. Because weather is playing havoc with cocoa. Its production has been reduced drastically. I'll tell you why. This is Ivory Coast, a country in West Africa. It produces about half of the world's cocoa beans. Apart from this, Ghana, Cameroon, Nigeria together contribute another quarter of the supply. These countries are facing bad weather. On some days, heavy rains are causing floods. On others, temperatures only get worse. These countries are becoming warmer. This has become a breeding ground for crop disease and rots, and cocoa crops have been drastically affected. You see, these are regional weather patterns. They have an outsized impact on global cocoa production because around 75% of all cocoa is produced by just 4 countries in West Africa. And that's not all. Apart from weather, war is also at work here. I'm talking about the war in Ukraine. It has caused the cost of fertilizer to jump. So cocoa plants are being denied nutrients. And again, the production has suffered. It's projected to be even worse than last year. If that happens, this will be the 3rd year of cocoa supply deficit with no hope in sight. Current weather patterns are threatening next year's crop as well. So things are only getting worse. And the result is this: cocoa factories around the world are slowing down. In North America, for instance, the processing reduced by 12% in the second quarter. This is the lowest for that period since 2008. The situation is similar in Europe and Asia. Factories are grounding the least cocoa since the pandemic began. Global inventories are at the lowest in almost 3 decades. And apart from cocoa problems, prices of sugar and palm oil have also been soaring. Sounds like the elixir of gods faces a perfect storm. Like I said, dark times for chocolates. The prices are going up. In Australia, they have been hiked by anywhere between 10 to 20%. In America, by about 14%. There are some countries where rising prices cannot be seen immediately. Experts say even if prices remain the same, the size of chocolates could be reduced. You may remember the term, shrinkflation. It has nothing to do with therapists overcharging patients. Shrinkflation is when companies reduce the size of a product, but they don't reduce the price. It's basically used to cut costs and boost profits. We saw this happen last year with the vastly embraced chocolate brand Cadbury. It shrunk the size of dairy milk by 10%, but did not reduce the price. So with prices changing, will consumers give up on chocolates? Well, experts don't think so, but small changes are expected. Consumers are definitely tightening their belts. The global chocolate industry is worth $117 billion. For the first time in 6 years, it saw sales volumes dip last year. But this does not mean that people are outright refusing chocolates. It only shows how they have reduced impulse purchasing. So the demand continues to stay strong, particularly in Europe and Asia. And even if price rise sounds like a piece of bad news, This is no apocalypse for chocolates, not yet at least. And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. In Israel, a car rammed into a group of protesters. In China, a massive fire destroyed a giant Buddha statue in a temple. This happened in the Gansu province. The statue was built in 1998. It was a replica of a sculpture that dates back to 425 AD. And in Greece, a firefighting plane crashed while it was battling wildfires. Finally, we're taking you back in history. On this day, in 1943, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini was forced to resign. He was voted out of power by his own Grand Council and was later arrested. Many believe that the removal of Mussolini was the first step towards Italy's decision to pull out of the Second World War. We're leaving you with that. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
One man took the glory that was Rome and brought it down in dust and ashes. Humiliation, defeat and despair. His boasting of the might of Italian arms was all bluff. But for 21 years, he got away with it.
The boastful Mussolini had crumpled already. He is now